Hello and welcome to this BMC Helix Immersion Days session about adapting IT service management for the DevOps era. My name is Peter Adams. I'm Senior Director of Product Management for the ITSM solutions at BMC. And when you talk about ITSM and DevOps, there's really two main ways to look at it. On the one hand, how can you apply some of these DevOps principles, automation, small releases, test automation, automation deployments, all of this, how can you apply it to the remedy software itself? And that's a topic of a separate session here. So, in our view, and we're working very hard to improve on that, you can apply many of the same principles to the ITSM solution itself. But this session is really more about the ITSM processes. So if a company adopts DevOps and agile thinking for either some of their teams or the entire organization, what impact does it have on the ITSM processes, right? What role does ITSM still play in that area? How may you need to have to adjust the ITSM processes to be able to work effectively and provide value in such scenarios? So that's really what we are talking about, right? And from our perspective, we talk a lot about the tech tsunami, and you've heard Nayaki talk about that in an earlier session, right? When you look at what's going on around multi-cloud, devices, how users access different IT functions, multi-channel, big data. There's a lot of talk about complexity, speed, heterogeneity, right? But from a process perspective, we believe that DevOps really the most influential trend in the IT industry that changes fundamentally how companies think about IT service management and what role IT service management plays, right? So while a lot of the complexity, etc., is handled through cognitive automation, as a key essential factor to address the increasing speed and complexity and heterogeneity, right? From a DevOps perspective, it's really about creating innovative new capabilities in the ITSM solution that deliver value, right? And I think it's generally recognized that companies have to adjust their ITSM processes to kind of factor in these new ways of working, as we sometimes refer to it. This is a quote here from CIO.com. And when you look at what has been going on around ITIL 4, this is very much along the same line of thinking, right? ITIL 4 has taken some of the ideas that have emerged in the DevOps and Agile area and try to kind of integrate it and merge it into the ITSM practices, right? Also expanding towards the development section overall. But when you look at even what you're doing around change management and service desk, right, established areas from an ITIL perspective, even there you see that practices and recommendations are changing, influenced by what's going on in the DevOps, Agile, or Lean IT area, right? So from our perspective, it's very relevant, and it's not about throwing ITSM or ITIL out the door. It's more about, what value can ITSM solution and the corresponding processes play in such when a company adjusts and rolls out DevOps practices, right? By the way, from our perspective, Helix ITSM and Remedy ITSM on premise are fully ready for ITIL 4. So we've already proactively invested in adding many of these capabilities, whether it's KCS or swarming or many of the other ones. So not only do we support traditional ITIL practices, but also some of the newer ones that are referred to in this area. And in fact, some of it is even influenced by our own thinking, and BMC employees are co-authoring and reviewing the information that goes into ITIL 4. So let's look at again what value an ITSM solution can provide, and specifically what value we, from a BMC perspective, with our BMC Helix solutions, can provide for a company that adopts DevOps. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's partial with some selective teams, or whether it's full across their entire organization. Some organizations really even change the entire IT structure along the lines of agile thinking. Um, so the key values are summarized here in these 4 points here, right? Ultimately, what matters is you want to improve the DevOps performance, meaning you want to deliver innovation faster, but still at high quality, right? So you want to enable a better outcome of that DevOps practice with delivering additional value that helps achieve that, right? And the 4 main value areas that we cover from a BMC Helix perspective are: number one, we're supporting these DevOps teams by uh, giving them faster access to supporting IT services. So I'll go into more detail in a second, but basically infrastructure, access, etc., all those DevOps teams need occasionally access to certain resources, and how can you give that to these DevOps teams as fast as you can, because all they care about it is speed and getting access to these things quickly so that they can deliver value quickly from their development activity, right? By the way, that's one of the reasons why many DevOps teams are operating often in the cloud, because here they don't have to wait for physical infrastructure, right? They can immediately get those resources that they need. And again, from a BMC Helix perspective, we help getting access to those resources through a single self-service interaction, right? Second part is that within the ITSM solution, we collect a lot of info, and very often this information is not available in other solutions. For example, understanding exactly what infrastructure is deployed and how it connects to each other, which customer, how the infrastructure is connected to a service, and then which customer is consuming a service, how happy the customer is, how many tickets they have submitted in the past. All of this information is often, ITSM, the ITSM solution is the only place where you can get this information, right? And so from that perspective, we look a lot into how can we share this information in a meaningful way, contextually relevant to these DevOps teams, right? And that's the second value, right? The third one is around customer support. So, traditionally when we talk about DevOps scenarios, you read a lot about, developers or DevOps team members basically getting notifications. They are basically on call and responsible, which works okay if you're a small startup, etc. But ultimately, when you have when you scale this out to an enterprise organization, this is no longer a feasible process here, right? So many companies are looking at customer support still as a separate function, IT support as a separate function, but then on the other hand, you may have to adjust it a little bit, because the way how these DevOps teams operate and the principles by which they work, doesn't quite align with the traditional way how IT support desk organizations are organized, right? And again, we help companies adjust their support processes along these principles, and I'll touch into that in quite a bit more detail. For example, by adopting models like swarming, right? And then the fourth area how we can deliver value is ensuring a high velocity of deployments without impacting quality. This is the area which is probably mostly discussed when you read in the internet, on the internet, or in the BMC communities around ITSM and Agile and DevOps, right? It's often about, okay, what role does a change management process play? When I do my automated deployments, etc., etc. So, even here, when it comes to the speed of deployments as well at a high quality, right? Again, service management has to play a role here, and I'll touch on that in more detail. So again, those are the 4 areas, and I want to go into a bit more detail on these 4 areas. So let's start with the self-service portion here. Again, if you think about what DevOps teams care about, is all about the speed of innovation, right? And that's really what makes that DevOps and Agile model so attractive, right? Now, one thing that is of value to these teams as they try to deliver innovation very rapidly is, all the barriers ideally would be removed, and they can access to the resources they need almost instantaneously, right? And one solution that helps here is our self-service capabilities, right? Whether it is getting access to defects so that the consumers of the service or the customers, whatever you want to call it, are able to submit a corresponding defect directly to the product team, which is possible through our digital workplace solution and the corresponding connectors to Jira, for example. Whether it's that or whether it's about the provisioning of resources, in the end, you're shortcutting a lot of processes, and ultimately the teams can be running faster, right? By avoiding you have to wait for resources, that you have to contact other teams to get insights on defects, etc. Right? So again, that's why a self-service solution is particular of value in a DevOps-centric organization, because you can do this automated and rapid provisioning without having to wait for others, right? Extremely important here. By the way, the entire digital workplace solution, as well as most of the other Helix solutions, are fully REST API enabled, which is extremely important for DevOps teams, because very often you want to be able to hook certain interactions into the automation pipeline, right? Typically, driven by tools like Jenkins, etc., right? And so it's an extremely important prerequisite. And again, we fulfill that from a BNC Helix perspective, that you can hook all of these interactions into the automation pipeline, right? And again, that applies to pretty much all of the BMC Helix solution, right? So the second topic, as we discussed, is about providing this contextual, valuable insight to the DevOps teams. I pick one example here. Again, the fact that we can discover cloud as well as on-premise infrastructure. So no matter whether they build their solutions based on cloud infrastructure or in-house, this solution like BMC Helix Discovery can go out, discover everything, model application models that basically determine how infrastructure and application layers are related. And then, as well, you can relate it to services in the CMDB, right? And again, all that information is accessible and valuable to these DevOps teams. That's information that they usually don't get anywhere else. So whether it's discovery or whether it's information that's in the CMDB or in the service desk, there's lots of information that is of value to these DevOps teams, and that's again how I recommend that you position to it. Because if you're a part of an ITSM organization, in the end, you have to think about how you position the value of this ITSM solution to these different DevOps teams, right? Now, the third point is around efficient collaboration or mature DevOps aligned support capabilities. The first point here is when you look at a DevOps support scenarios, I mentioned before that very often these DevOps teams operate on cloud infrastructure or leverage external cloud resources and services. So if something goes wrong, there is a chance that that whatever has gone wrong in the external solution or in the service that these teams are consuming, and they have to reach out to this external vendor and basically ask for a resolution. Now, typically this again is a manual process, but one thing that helps here is if you automatically connect the ITSM solution in-house with vendor support solution, something we call ticket brokering, or sometimes in the telco world is also referred to e-bonding, right? So you can automatically broker tickets from the ITSM solution out to external service providers, to their support systems. For example, if you're using AWS and something goes wrong, you can create a ticket with an AWS support fully automatically based on configurable policies. And then, once the ticket has been forwarded, you have visibility into what's happening with this external ticket from within the ITSM screen. And you can even exchange nodes, and the status of the external ticket and the local ticket, so to speak, is synchronized. So extremely valuable capability specifically for DevOps teams, because they are more likely interacting with external vendors, and sometimes resolution of an issue involves collaborating with external folks here, right? So that's again one way how we have adjusted our support solution. We've introduced this ticket brokering capability to align better with the needs of a DevOps organization, right? Now, the second and main topic of my discussion today is actually around swarming, which is ultimately a way how to organize your support activity that's less oriented around the traditional rigid, tiered approach with frontline, level 2, level 3, etc., but more, in a collaborative way. And it's a standard or a practice that is kind of governed by this Consortium for Service Innovation. They're the kind of organization that are, driving this forward, and it's actually a very helpful web page where you can get a lot of information about swarming. And this idea of swarming is actually discussed also in ITIL 4 and various M and some of the newer IT service management frameworks, let's say that way, right? And again, it's a process that aligns better with the principles that DevOps teams have often established. If you um, think about some of the practices that and beliefs that DevOps teams have, right? It's about autonomous organization. It's about a collaborative approach. It's about jointly creating value, and not so much, following a rigid process. All these things align much better with this swarming approach and with the traditional tiered approach, right? So let's look into some of the details how this works, right? Now, if you look at the classical tiered support structure, you have different levels. Tickets are either resolved in the level 1 or frontline support, then they're pushed on to the next group, and it sits in the queue and it waits there until somebody in level 2 support picks it up, looks at it, again pushes it on to the next one if they cannot resolve it, right? So it's a linear approach where often you have tickets waiting in the queue. And work in progress is really a red flag for many of these DevOps teams. That's a key principle, that you should not let things sit in the queue for too long. Where work has started but not completed. So that in itself is again a counter to what many DevOps teams are practicing. But in the end, again, that's also then impacting the overall efficiency and the time to resolution, right? So again, you spend time in level 1, potentially level 2, level 3, and it doesn't matter really where the answer lies. Let's say level 3, right? Very often you kind of have to go through the process, through all the phases before it really ends up where the solution is. And again, some of that takes time and effort, right? Also, because the teams usually are centered around one very specific technology, are often kind of very homogeneous from an expertise perspective. They tend to, and they basically see an inflow of work in the queue. They're often trying to, find barrier or define barriers around the activity to make sure they can work off most effectively, right? So, for example, they say, oh, if I need to work on a ticket in level 2, I need to have all of this information, and if the ticket doesn't have it, I just bump it back to level 1 support, and they need to find out about all this information and add it to the ticket, right? So it's a very myopic view. It's optimized for the team itself, but that often again implies that things are pushed back. Nobody really has the bigger picture in mind, so to speak, and you see frequent bounces, right? Then ultimately, it does somewhat encourage a hero culture, right? So if you have specialized knowledge in some place, right, you eventually get all the tickets, and you're the one who are solving it, right? And you're keeping that expertise in your head, not sharing it with the others, because then they continue to send these things over to you. So it encourages a hero culture, but as I said, not in a good way, right? So how does a swarming process look like, and how is this different? And the example that I plan to use here is a process that we actually use at BMC. We use swarming actually in multiple areas. This description here is a bit more oriented around how our own customer support acts, and they have implemented swarming a number of years ago. Um, but we actually use swarming as well in our in product organization. So we see, for example, on a daily basis what new potential defects come in, and we have to review those on a regular basis. And so we meet in a group on a regular basis and handle this intake of potential defects as part of our organization, right? But again, what I describe here is more focused on how our customer support works. So first of all, anything that is of high importance, severity 1, goes into a separate swarm, and it's called the severity number 1 swarm. Interesting enough, I mean, this is probably closest to the traditional service desk model, which has a concept of major incident management, if you recall. Major incident management by definition had always been a collaborative approach, and you always had to create a war room, get your subject matters experts together. Somebody is coordinating everything, somebody's handling communication with the external stakeholders. So by nature, it was a kind of collaborative activity. And ultimately, what you do in a severity number 1 swarm is somewhat similar, right? You get a group together that really focus on these high impact severity number 1 issues, right? Again, the team's ultimately responsible to define how exactly such a swarm group will be structured, how many people participate, what's the rotation, things like that. So, that's a model that we have established here at BMC, but, in your organization, it could be different. The groups could be bigger, could be smaller. Again, that's ultimately the autonomy that each team has, right? So you typically have a swarm lead that again handles more the communication, and then the other subject matter are more subject matter experts that do the research, test out solutions, etc., etc. And eventually, this has to be communicated back to the customer, right? So again, that's severity number 1 swarm structure, but again, that covers only 1% of the cases that come into BMC, right? The majority really are around that go to a local dispatch swarm. And the local dispatch swarm, again, is a group that basically looks at all the inflow of cases, and then basically tries to solve as many of them right away. Typically up to 30% here are solved right away. And sometimes they're called cherry pickers because it's really important that they intentionally should pick the things that they can solve right away. And that may be the easy ones, yeah, and they can pick the cherry, so to speak, but that's intentional because whatever can be solved quickly should be solved quickly and not sit in a queue so that others can solve it, right? At BMC, again, that those teams meet every 60 to 90 minutes. They basically review all the inflow. They pick the things that can be solved immediately. Um, and as you can see here already, it's typically consists of people with different experience. In fact, the idea of having a heterogeneous team is an essential design idea of such swarming, because you want to have people from different functional background or product background, as well as from different experience levels, right? Jointly together, and the heterogeneity actually helps cover as many tickets as possible, so to speak, in such a dispatch swarm, right? The other exercise that they have to do is, if the ticket cannot be solved right away, then it basically would be assigned to a so-called backlog swarms, right? So these are swarms that are formed by different product team experts. Again, here a heterogeneous, a diverse set of people, different product expertise, different experience, sometimes different language and location. Again, intentionally a heterogeneous structure. And they would basically look at the inflow that is passed on by the dispatch swarm team, right? Again, those backlog swarms would basically, solve the majority of issues. Again, here they meet regularly, maybe not every 60 to 90 minutes, but multiple times per day, and look at again the inflow of cases that could not be solved right away. So they're typically a bit more challenging problems here. Again, the big thing is, you're not working on this as an individual, but you're typically looking at this as a group of people with different background, and that increases the chance that this can be solved, and then also, and that's somewhat implied, is that inherently there's a lot of knowledge transfer going on, right? Again, that's why it's so important to bring in people of different experience levels, different technology background, etc. Right? So this kind of implicit knowledge transfer is a very important aspect of swarming here. So again, one of the key reasons why swarming, we believe swarming works better in an organization that kind of transitions over to a DevOps and agile model, is that again follows the same principles, so to speak, that are promoted by DevOps: the autonomy and self-organization, this kind of knowledge transfer, the fact that people collaborate. Work is not sitting in an email or in a queue. It's really based on collaboration, and you're trying to prevent the accumulation of work in a queue, right? That just sits there. And part of it is also then, as you regularly work off the inflow of cases or incidents coming in, right? You're also protecting individuals from burnout, because they don't have to, do these night sessions where they say, oh, my queue is full. I kind of gradually see my queue increasing. Now I have to do a night session to kind of remove or reduce the queue length, right? So that is avoided by basically trying to work things off on a regular basis, right? And again, when you look at the results, and again, these are the results that we've seen on the BMC side, you see clear enhancements around medium time to resolution. Customer satisfaction, of course, is often tied to the way how quickly we resolve something. You see generally tickets being closed within a certain timeline that's acceptable by the customers, right? Overall, again, you're trying to avoid an increasing, backlog or an increasing queue, whatever you want to call it, and really, organize it so that you can, work off the inflow of cases or incidents in the internal service desk, so to speak, right? Then again, part of the benefit is also that you are reducing the onboarding time, because as less experienced service desk agents would participate in such a swarm activity, they learn a lot, as they observe how experienced support agents or service desk agents troubleshoot issue. They have the product know-how from other people, and so in general the learning and onboarding is a lot faster, right? And overall, you're freeing up then resources for other innovative offerings, right? Now, I want to geek out here a little bit around complexity theory here and introduce something that is probably less known here, and it's called Cynefin framework. This is a Welsh word, and I believe it means place of multiple belongings. Ultimately, what this reflects is a way of thinking around complexity of systems, and it doesn't just apply to IT. This could apply to any kind of activity, right? Whether it's running a business, of course, running an IT organization. All of this could be looked at with this framework here. And the framework has basically four major areas or domains, as they're called here. One is the obvious domain where there's a clear relationship between cause and effect, and it's immediately visible what the cause is, and correspondingly what the effect is, right? Very clear and obvious relationship, and what you mainly have to do is understanding quickly identify what the cause is, and then respond to it, right? Complicated still has a clear relationship between cause and effect, but sometimes you have to spend a bit more time analyzing what is the situation, what is the cause. But once you've done that, you still basically know how to respond, and the response will give the right results and outcomes, right? Complex is usually when there's no clear relationship anymore between cause and effect. Because they're so entangled, right? So there's so many moving parts that, as you change one thing, you're not really sure what the outcome is because there's so many other constraints and relationships in the system. And in this area, you need to think a bit more about experimentation, etc. Over time, you may understand better what's going on, and it kind of moves into the complicated domain, but very often you don't know exactly the cause and effect relationship, and you're kind of experimenting a bit here, right? And then chaotic is just something where you don't even understand exactly what to probe, etc. Very often you just have to act and see how the system behaves here, right? Now, the interesting part is when you look in general what's going on in IT, more and more the obvious and sometimes even the complicated things are automated, heavily automated, right? So when you look at a service desk activity, while 10 years ago there were many obvious things, more and more of the activity that is obvious, and again sometimes even the complicated ones, are automated, right? And so that's the point where organizations, IT organizations, have to think about, okay, how do I act in a complex or even chaotic scenario, right? What practices do I need to apply? How can I get to best outcomes, right? And that's the interesting part of this framework, that it helps companies, any organization really, to think more about, how to operate when things become more complex or even chaotic, right? And so from that perspective, it's quite interesting to look at this. And again, my claim is that, as IT organizations will face more of these complex and sometimes chaotic scenarios where there's no clear, again, relationship between cause and effect, and it's good to understand then these practices here, right? And again, if you see how swarming can be applied to this, it leads itself very well to complicated or even complex scenarios, and that's really why this is very interesting for the future here, as things are moving away from the obvious domain more towards a complicated or even complex domain, right? A swarming approach where you have multiple people attend, can probe different situations or conditions and trying to understand what the situation is. Doing this in parallel is much faster and leads to better result, right, than if you assign a ticket to a single person and they kind of have to work through all of this themselves, right? Plus, again, a side effect is always that you can capture uh, the detailed knowledge, as you do this and kind of formalize it, right? And the same for the complex domain. Again, the idea is that a swarming approach, which is a collaborative approach, actually fits much better to problems from the complex domain, right? Because you can, extend, bring in people, probe the system, experiment, bring even external cloud suppliers, representatives from the external cloud suppliers, work through theories, eliminate anything that didn't work. In the end, you're finding it and you're kind of in a group kind of closing out based on, the learnings from these kind of collaborative activities, right? Again, all of that extremely hard if you assign it to a single person, right? And so this collaborative approach, I think, will in the future become more and more important, right? So that was a kind of a bit of a sidetrack around this Cynefin framework. Let's go back to talking about what BMC Helix can help you around, for any organization that embarks on kind of a DevOps restructuring. So we talked about, again, the ability um, to broker tickets automatically to other groups. We talk about swarming as a process. Now, when it comes to tool support for this kind of swarming activity, we have now introduced various capabilities in the solution that support this kind of swarming approach uh, within our solution. And one thing that we released most recently in version 1908 is the ability to create these collaboration sessions in established enterprise collaboration tools. In 1908, we are supporting Microsoft Teams, but in the future, we plan to extend that to solutions like Slack. And then, from within this collaboration tool, you can actually trigger interactions with the ITSM system, whether that's, reading what is part of a ticket, whether it is updating the ticket, finding other people who are knowledgeable, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the interactions that are part of this collaboration option here. Sometimes we refer to this also as ChatOps because the idea is similar as the ChatOps idea. Um, you basically are in a collaboration tool and you don't have to leave the tool to trigger actions. Now in the ChatOps world, this is typically ops actions, meaning you're restarting a server or you're maybe kicking off a new deployment, right? But in the support scenario, this is more support-oriented actions, right? And again, this could be looking at a knowledge article, or again finding somebody who could join the swarm, things like that, or ultimately updating and closing out tickets, right? This interaction, by the way, is supported by a cognitive chatbot agent. So this is a scenario where the cognitive agent supports not the business user, but in this case, different IT users. Um, and that would allow, such interaction with the ITSM system through natural language. So the chatbot basically understands the intent and then can ask the right questions to be able to execute that action on the remote ITSM system, right? So again, that's, and we continue to build out these swarming centric features in the ITSM solution. We plan to build this out further, helping companies, for example, to schedule swarming sessions and driving this planning activity. Much of that today would have to be handled outside, right? But there's a few more ideas we have around the swarming aspect, right? Now, last but not least, I want to talk about the fourth area, and that's the alignment between DevOps and the change management process, which again is often a very controversial area in the discussion around ITSM and DevOps, right? What we offer here is again a fully automated integration between agile software development tools like Jira. We support a number of others, CA Agile or Rally or Azure DevOps. We support a variety of these agile software development tools. And what you can do is basically when you plan for a certain user story to be deployed, once it's completed, you want to release it and deploy the corresponding software, right? You can basically fully automatically create a corresponding change request in the ITSM system, right? And again, maybe if there's no risk with the deployment, you can basically fully automatically create the change request. It's still valuable to create one because support needs to know what has been updated. You want to have a tracking record from an audit perspective. There's many good reasons why to do this. Still, again, you don't need to hold up this kind of agile development process because if there's no risk, then you don't really need to require an approval or a CAP meeting, right? So you can do these implement these change requests, but mark this as a low risk item, and it would fully automatically be passed through, and you can increase corresponding the velocity of the DevOps teams because they don't have to manually create these change records. Very often teams don't like to do that. On the other hand, you're also not holding anything up because you're passing it through without any CAP meeting or approval. By the way, again, that's a common misperception. There's a lot of black and white thinking in this area. People often say, oh, no, every change has to go through a CAP meeting. And then on the other hand, the DevOps folks say, oh no, you don't need to have any change at all. In our perspective, you have to have a more nuanced thinking. If there is no risk, you can for sure pass things through without a CAP meeting, right? But then on the other hand, there are often scenarios where a change should be created and not just created, but there should be some control around it, right? And that's really, from our perspective, the kind of key holy grail here is that box that's called risk calculation, right? Because ultimately, there are multiple reasons why you may want to hold up such a change, even if you have fully automated CI/CD pipelines and test automation, everything, right? So maybe it is a regulated system and you have to create the change request and somebody has to approve it. Maybe the team that is implementing the change request doesn't have a good track record and they've created multiple outages for their system in the past. So maybe you do want to hold it up and there should be some control around it, right? So it's not about this black and white thinking. It's precisely identifying when the risk is higher that something fails and when should there be some change control, or whether it's just a kind of change logging and you should let things pass through. That's really the key battleground here. And from our perspective, we're looking at, to some degree, we have this today. We're looking at building out a multi-factor risk calculation that takes multiple inputs into account and really then ultimately says, yeah, this can go through automatically, or no, somebody needs to look at this, right? I say we have this because we can today, look at historic data in the ITSM system and look at, which services had, outages and issues, unsuccessful changes, and that, would determine, basically the risk calculation, right? But we do want to build this out further and taking, security scans, test automation results, code scans and other things into account to really have an accurate risk calculation that really reflects to have change control when necessary, but not, in areas which have low risk and where they should go through, right? So that's really the focus of our solution. But again, you already have the full automation between the agile software development tools, the ITSM system. You have kind of a basic risk calculation that takes the history into account, but more to be done in this area, right? So again, that basically explains a bit what we're doing around DevOps and ITSM. Again, from our perspective, if you're an ITSM team, it's extremely important that you understand how these DevOps teams operate, that you think about articulating the value that ITSM can provide to these teams, and basically collaborate with them to make sure that you implement this value for the teams, right? Because that will really ensure that the entire IT organization, including the leadership, will understand the value of an ITSM solution, right? So again, these four values are accelerating the delivery of IT services, supporting IT services to these DevOps teams, again, mostly around infrastructure, resources, etc. But there could be other scenarios, right? Providing this valuable contextual insight, information basically that is in the ITSM solution, whether it's discovery, whether it's CMDB information, providing that to the DevOps teams, right? Establishing support capabilities that are scaling out for large enterprises, yet are aligned with DevOps principles, for example, swarming. And ultimately, we can help companies accelerate the rate of successful changes or deployments, as it's often called in the DevOps world, right? By, on the one hand, automatically integrating with agile software development tools, but on the other hand, really providing intelligent risk assessments so that low risk changes can be deployed automatically and higher risk changes are held up, right? All of that, again, is part of our bigger vision of providing a cognitive IT service and operations management solutions to our customers. So all based on cognitive platform, and we do use cognitive in multiple areas in the functionality that I described here. So extremely important part of our strategy here, right? With that, I'd like to thank you for joining this BMC Helix Immersion Days session here. I hope that you find this information valuable, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at next year's BMC Helix Immersion Days. Thanks and bye-bye.